Hey, buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Kilbin is the name and Hearthstone is the game, and these are the 10 best legendary cards to craft. Now, specifically when I say the best to craft, I don't necessarily mean the best cards in the game right now at this exact moment. When I determine this list and the cards on this list, it's really more about finding a balance between cards that are good today, they're playable, they're in high tier decks, but also understanding that some cards are around forever and they're going to be important parts of your collection today and long into the future because they are in the classic set and will never actually rotate out of standard format. So it's a little bit of both. It's strong cards, good cards, relevant cards, cards you want to play today, but will still also be important fundamental pieces of your collection. So in other words, there's a little bit more emphasis placed on the classic set and neutral cards as well, because of course class cards have less flexibility because you can only play them in one class. So at the end of the day, this video and the cards in this list are more about building a fundamentally strong, valuable card collection of legendaries in Hearthstone, not about necessarily crafting the exact card you need for any given deck. Now that said, there are essentially two different philosophies when it comes to crafting. One is just craft the deck you need and build a good deck and play that deck. This is not a video for that style of crafting. If that's what you want to do, that works. That can be fantastic. You can go that route, build yourself an awesome deck. This is for a different kind of crafting that's more about just building a good, strong, flexible, high utility Hearthstone collection over a longer term time period. So if that's not for you, this video might not be as helpful for you. Now, on top of that, of course, I am somewhat arbitrarily choosing 10 cards here to highlight. That does mean that there are a lot of solid craftable cards not on this list. I just picked the 10 best to essentially help you define a priority. The number one card on this list being the best to craft, the one that's going to give you the most average value in the game today. Now, that said, I did want to at least name a few honorable mentions that I think are still really good in the meta today and still going to be great pieces for your collection outside of the top 10. Those were Blood Mage Thalnos, Lord Godfrey, Frost Lich Jaina, Zola the Gorgon, and Tyrion Fordring. All of those see at least a little bit of play today. Some of those are classic cards that are going to be awesome for the foreseeable future, for a very, very long time down the road. So each of those would be great fits in your collection. Now, beyond that, though, we have the 10 very best as far as I'm concerned. So let's go ahead and without any further ado, jump into the top 10 best legendary cards to craft in Hearthstone in the Witchwood meta. Starting off at the number 10 spot here is Harrison Jones. And this is one of those go-to tech cards in Hearthstone. A tech card is a card that's specifically designed to answer something your opponent might want to do. And of course, in the case of Harrison Jones, that is answering weapons. And the great thing about Harrison Jones is not only is it weapon removal, because there's a lot of different weapon removal in the game, including the free card Acidic Swamp Ooze, but Harrison Jones is really powerful and impactful weapon removal because not only does it destroy your weapon, but it swings even harder because it also draws you cards equal to the durability. So you don't just disadvantage your opponent, but you also advantage yourself sometimes in a really powerful way. And the combination there is what makes Harrison Jones kind of the premium choice for weapon tech removal in Hearthstone today. So a handful of decks are running Harrison right now in a weapon dominant meta, but frankly, there are always going to be weapons in Hearthstone. And Harrison, even if he falls out of fashion in 3 or 4 months in the next expansion, he'll come back down the road someday. He's one of those cards you can just slot into any mid-range or control deck and feel like he still has an impact and does something significant. So he is a great card to add to your Hearthstone set. Up next here is Malfurion the Pestilent, one of the Death Knight hero cards added in Knights of the Frozen Throne, and really one of the best hero cards, or at least the most consistent or reliable hero cards, because right now Malfurion represents a card that can be played across various druid archetypes. Not only is this good in more tempo or aggressive decks like Spiteful Summoner Druid right now, but it's also fantastic in more control druid decks too, slower decks that are looking for defensive tools. And that really comes down to Malfurion's flexibility with his hero power and in fact the flexibility of what he summons onto the board. Because that instant impact of getting the poisonous spiders or the taunted scarabs, those can be great in different kinds of scenarios and board states depending on what you're facing down. And on top of that, of course, his hero power being able to go for aggression with a +3 attack hero power, that's awesome sometimes. But you can also armor up and play defensively. So anybody that plays Druid is probably going to find a deck or a time that Malfurion the Pestilent is going to be a huge impact card. And I gotta say, it's one of those cards that just always feels really good to draw. It's great to know that it's there. It answers so many different kinds of deck styles, maybe burst decks, for instance, armoring them up. The repeatable damage can push through more defensive decks as well. So Malfurion is basically the go-to ultimate card for Druid as far as I'm concerned. He's a fantastic card to have. Moving on to the number 8 spot here, we have Prince Kellaseth. And this is one of those cards and one of the few cards in Hearthstone that is able to define a deck archetype all by itself. And particularly right now in combination with Spiteful Summoner, this Kellaseth Summoner minion-based kind of aggressive tempo style of play has become a dominant force in Hearthstone. It's most commonly seen in Spiteful Druid right now, but it also sees play in Spiteful Priest as well, and Kellaseth has tended to show up in a couple other decks here and there as well. Of course, used to be Tempo Rogue, but there's just always a deck here or there that finds a way to play Kellaseth, and I don't think that's going to change for the foreseeable future as long as Kellaseth is in standard format. It looks like he's going to have that big impact turn 2 that defines some decks and essentially gives a deck an instant win condition. If you hit Prince Kellaseth on turn 2, there's a really good chance that's going to allow you to snowball a stat advantage on board into winning the game. And ultimately, sacrificing 2-cost cards isn't really all that big of a penalty when you can just win the game sometimes drawing a card like Kellaseth. So a great tool to have in your collection, not only because it empowers a couple great decks in Hearthstone today, but it's one of those things that just fits sometimes and will likely continue to define very powerful decks in the future as well. Up next here is Alexstrasza, one of my all-time favorite legendary cards and a part of the classic set, which always helps for lists like this as well, because you know Alexstrasza is always going to be in standard format outside of a Hall of Fame rotation, but in that case you get your dust back anyway, so who cares? But the great thing about Alexstrasza, of course, is, again, flexibility. Most usually, I'd say we see Alexstrasza used as an offensive tool, where you deal essentially 15 or less damage to your opponent, taking them from 30 to 15 health, typically setting up some sort of burst damage combo. That's seen today in Hearthstone with the Mind Blast Control Priest that's really popular on the ladder, where they Alexstrasza you and then hit you with a few Mind Blasts or Shadow Reaper Anduin hero powers on top of that, killing you from really high health totals. But beyond that, Alexstrasza has been used in the past with things like Freeze Mage, and any kind of dragon deck can often put Alexstrasza in as well, because sometimes she can prove as a defensive tool as well, where you just gain 14 or more life by using Alexstrasza on your own face. And that makes her a cool tool for all kinds of different control decks, even if she's not necessarily the centerpiece of some 2-turn kill or combo setup. She can still just be a strong, powerful tool because she has such a big way to swing and make an instant direct impact on the game. So that said, Alexstrasza, again, seems like a great card to just have around for anybody that wants to play a slower style or combo style. She can do so much and make such a large impact, and has been one of the better cards in Hearthstone since the very, very beginning, and I don't see that changing anytime soon. So up next here is our first Witchwood card. This is Ginn Greymane, and this 6-mana 6/5 has a pretty neat effect that if you only run even cost cards in your deck, of course he reduces your hero power down to 1 mana instead of 2 mana. And right now that is used primarily by Even Paladin, the best deck in Hearthstone at the time that this video was recorded, the most played and highest win rate deck across all ranks in Hearthstone today. And that's because a 1-mana hero power for Paladin is very, very strong. Getting a repeatable 1/1 that just allows you to flex in to so many different turns because it's so cheap and efficient can really help empower a deck that wants to go wide on the board, like Even Paladin. So of course, Ginn Greymane completely creates the opportunity for that sort of deck to exist. Beyond that, there are a few other Even decks as well that have shown up. Even Shaman is a pretty strong deck today, and Even Warlock, a sort of handlock or control warlock, has also made the rounds a little bit, although less popular. So already, even in just a short month, Ginn Greymane has created 3 viable decks by himself. That's incredible for a single card to do, not to mention, of course, the best deck in the game. That's remarkably powerful. Now, on top of that, Ginn Greymane, in my mind, is the sort of card that's only going to get better over time, because right now the total amount of expansions available in Hearthstone standard format is limited to 4, but as the next 2 expansions are released, that number will increase to 5 and then to 6, which means there will be more even cards available to choose from, and typically more cards to choose from means there are going to be better cards to include. So Ginn Greymane theoretically will get better over time, already an incredible card to have, and if you want to play the best deck in the game, you need this guy. So not only incredibly good now, but probably a strong investment for the future as well. So up next here we have Leroy Jenkins, and Leroy has been on every one of these lists I've ever made, and that tells you something. And in fact, I think he's even probably topped the list or been in the top 3 before. Not quite as strong of a rating this time around because Leroy today isn't quite as prominent in the meta as he has been in the past, although he is still seeing some play here and there across a handful of different decks. But with Leroy, it really comes down to the fact that he's a classic card and a great tool to use as a finishing piece for so many different decks. That 6 damage for 5 mana still remains one of the most efficient charging damage options in the game in Hearthstone, and because, of course, he's neutral as well, that means any class can gain access to Leroy Jenkins. So yeah, maybe he's not as good as Fireball, but not everybody has access to Fireball, so Leroy becomes a suitable alternative. And of course, Leroy has powered so many different combos throughout the past in Hearthstone, all kinds of different cards utilized with this thing, from Power Overwhelming to Shadow Step to Cold Blood, and there's a handful more than that, Faceless Manipulator, all kinds of different stuff. So Leroy looks to be one of the safest cards in Hearthstone to craft, because you know eventually someday there's going to be some aggressive deck that finds a home for this thing that needs that 6 damage in addition to all the other likely face damage cards they have, but sometimes you just got to have that Leroy in there. So a good card to have. If you never ever play aggro decks, maybe you don't want Leroy, but even then he showed up in control and combo decks as finishers too, so you might still need a Leroy in your collection. A great card to have, a staple for Hearthstone. You just can't go wrong with this one. So up next here at the number 4 spot, we have Paladin's Sunkeeper Teram. And this guy has just been the ultimate, absolute swing card for Paladin ever since his release in Journey to Unguro, and that hasn't changed today. Sunkeeper Teram, of course, a part of Even Paladin, already discussed previously with Ginn Greymane, the best deck in the game, and frankly, one of the best cards in the best deck in the game, and often a card that secures a victory for the best deck in the game. Sometimes by buffing your own minions to attack your opponent for a ton of damage, sometimes just negating the threats of your opponent and allowing you to swing the board really strongly based on the symmetrical effect that Sunkeeper Teram provides. And frankly, I think Sunkeeper Teram is quite an overpowered card that has probably flown under the radar for a very long time when it comes to nerfs, because for a long time now, Paladin and multiple versions of Paladin, and in fact, have dominated the Hearthstone meta, and I think Sunkeeper Teram has a big part to play in that fact. This is one of the best cards available to Paladin. It shows up in so many different decks, both aggressive decks and control decks find ways to run Sunkeeper Teram, and that's one reason he's so high on this list, despite the fact that he's a class card, is because of that inherent flexibility. So just an unbelievably powerful tool for the class. One of the most dominant and influential cards in the entire game, I would say at this point. And if you want to play Paladin, you basically have to have Sunkeeper Teram. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to do the things that you're supposed to do for the class. So a complete no-brainer when it comes to crafting if you ever want to play Paladin. And then as we move into the top 3, we actually have another class card. And I don't traditionally rank class cards this high on these sorts of lists because, of course, they can only be used by one class, reducing their flexibility and playability for a lot of different players. But much like is the case with Sunkeeper Teram, Blood Reaver Gul'dan is just so darn powerful. It's just ridiculously good. And, of course, incredibly flexible as well, much like Sunkeeper Teram, and then it can be played in both aggressive Warlock decks like Zoo, who use Sunkeeper Teram as a finisher and a reload tool at the end of the game, but also, of course, used very predominantly in control or cube lock decks, which are some of the most popular and strong on the Hearthstone ladder today as well. So Gul'dan, again, a class card that has completely defined the Hearthstone meta since its release, and particularly over the last 2 expansions, Gul'dan is everywhere, and he just completely reshapes what decks are viable and playable, and what tech cards have to be included as well, because of course cube lock basically means weapon removal, and silence are completely necessary to succeed at all in Hearthstone these days. So because of the raw influence of this card, because of the direct impact it makes when you play it, often just sealing games every single time it hits the board, summoning a huge board of stuff, sometimes just summoning enough Doom Guards to kill the opponent outright, giving you just an absurdly unfair hero power on top of that. Gul'dan, it's just synonymous with Hearthstone today. Gul'dan is everywhere, probably the best card in the game, I guess you'd have to say, in some ways, or the strongest, and exactly the kind of thing that when it's in your collection, you end up playing it because you know you've got a good deck with Warlock. You know Gul'dan is the centerpiece of that deck. And that's why, despite being only a Warlock card, still one of the best 3 cards to craft as far as I'm concerned, just because of the power level and the influence he can add to your collection all by himself. So now moving on to the number 2 spot, we actually have another Witchwood card, which might surprise you. This is Baku the Moon Eater, and kind of the cousin, or maybe brother, I don't know, to our friend Ginn Greymane, which we saw previously on the list. And of course, this is the odd version of the same mechanic, where if your deck is only including odd cards, then you upgrade your hero power at the start of the game. And Baku the Moon Eater has empowered a handful of different decks already in Hearthstone. We've seen things like Odd Hunter showed up first, I guess, just because the 3 damage burst from the hero power in Baku Hunter was really scary. We also saw Odd Rogue, which became a successful deck that's still lingering around in kind of tier 2 today. And then finally we saw Odd Warrior as well show up, and Odd Warrior, that hero power just gives you a lot of life gain. And those are all 3 kind of tier 2-ish decks, I think at the moment, maybe a couple tier 3 decks, but competitive, if not completely meta-defining. So you might be asking why Baku takes a higher priority than Ginn Greymane, for instance, that I mentioned previously. And that's because I think 2 things. I think Baku is still today more flexible. The only really good deck Ginn Greymane empowers is Even Paladin, and although it's the best deck, the other decks like Even Shaman and Even Warlock, which is barely even worth mentioning at all, aren't quite as popular or strong. Baku, on the other hand, has a handful of different pretty good decks. And it's debatable whether you think one amazing deck is better than a few solid decks, but to me, a few solid decks take priority when it comes to crafting a collection that's viable for multiple classes. Because right now, if you craft Ginn Greymane, you're kind of shoehorned into Paladin, maybe a little bit of Shaman is possible. If you craft Baku the Moon Eater, on the other hand, you have a bevy of options. You can choose different things, and most importantly, I think, you can choose multiple archetypes. Ginn Greymane right now basically empowers 2 more tempo, aggression-oriented decks, mid-rangey at best, if you want to call them that. Baku, on the other hand, can empower super aggressive decks like Baku Hunter and Baku Rogue, but he can also empower slow control decks like Odd Warrior. So because of his increased flexibility across classes and his increased flexibility across archetypes, Baku, to me, took the edge. Beyond that, I think the potential for Baku, much like Ginn Greymane, is going to increase in the future, and perhaps even increase more so than with Ginn Greymane, because ultimately I think the upgraded hero powers often have more advantages than the discounted hero powers from Ginn Greymane. So Baku, to me, seems like a better craft. I didn't even talk about Odd Paladin. For some reason, it just completely blanked on me until right now. A deck that has lost in popularity, certainly, but is still viable. So that's another example of a tier 2-ish, tier 3-ish deck that Baku has enabled, making it essentially 4 pretty strong decks that this thing works with. But again, just a good card to have. You also have a long time to use him because he's not going to be rotating out of standard format for at least 2 years at this point, or almost 2 years. So a neutral card A long lifespan left, works in a lot of different decks, and not only that, but empowers decks, is the centerpiece, the defining aspects of different decks. All of that to me makes this a really good card to craft. But there's one more card that I think is even better to have in your collection at this point, and that is the Lich King. Now, normally I don't include non-classic cards at the #1 spot in these sorts of lists, but right now it's not even debatable. Lich King is the most played legendary card in Hearthstone at the moment. More than any other legendary, he's included in more decks than anybody else. Beyond that, Lich King is the kind of card that just fits into any deck. Maybe not the most aggressive face decks, and of course not Baku decks because he's even, but essentially any archetype, from really fast decks looking to kill the opponent to mid-range decks that are more stat-oriented to control decks, all of them have some way to utilize Lich King, and you can see that in action when you look at the kinds of decks Lich King is included in right now. He just fits in so many different ways because he does everything pretty well, right? He's an 8/8, which is a huge stat line. He has Taunt, which gives him some defensive utility, and his Death Knight cards can become really powerful and suit a lot of different needs. They can be aggressive, sometimes helping you build a board. They can be defensive. They can be super swingy. They can just offer a ton of outright damage. Anything you need, Lich King can provide it. Now, of course, he is unreliable sometimes. You don't get what you need always. But there are other times he sticks on board for a turn or two. He's just such a big stat body that your opponent can't address it. And he snowballs into ridiculous victories all by himself because he got a couple awesome Lich King cards. And then you just ended the game. When you combine that with other synergies for Lich King, things like Taunt Druid, for instance, where you get to summon Lich Kings again and again, that becomes even more incredible. So not only is this guy kind of universally strong across every kind of deck, he's also good in particular synergies and combo decks. He opens up opportunities to answer things like Death Grip, for instance. You can beat combo decks single-handedly, which doesn't exist very often in Hearthstone right now. So a neat little utility tool, a raw power tool, an incredibly popular choice, which in and of itself just expresses how much people seem to have uses for this card and find deck lists to support him. So to me, even though he will be rotating out of standard format in essentially 11 months or so, you gotta have this guy for the next 11 months. You're just not gonna have a complete Hearthstone collection. Every deck is gonna be lacking a little bit of something here and there when you need a Lich King. So you need this to work. You need this to compete at this point, or you're just going to have limited options, and you're not going to be able to play all the decks you want, and you're going to be missing out on one of the most powerful and influential cards in the game. So that's why, despite not being a classic card, I still think Lich King is the very best legendary card to craft in Hearthstone today. And there you go, folks. That's my list of the top 10 legendary cards to craft in Hearthstone in the Witchwood meta. Now, please, of course, be warned. This is my personal opinion. I did go about it in a fairly scientific way by defining some attributes of all of these different cards and essentially considering their flexibility and resiliency and time left in the meta, their popularity today, and I combined all those attributes and came up with a system that I think defines pretty well what's going to be best suited for you. Lich King, of course, topped that. But you should always use your discretion when crafting cards. If Lich King doesn't look fun to you or look stupid to you, or you think for some reason he's not right for you, okay, that's fine. Use this as a general guideline. Don't follow it to the T, to the letter. And also, of course, always seek a second opinion. Ask around. Look at a different guide. Don't rely just on me. Frankly, ask in the comments. Tons of people will have opinions and thoughts and say, Regis, you're so crazy wrong. Why would you ever craft Baku over Ginn? And that's awesome. Great. I think recommendation by committee is a great example of how to build a good collection too. It's not just about me. If anything, this is just a platform for discussion, a point of data for you to consider amongst many other points of data. All of that said, if you do have some thoughts, recommendations, questions, of course, leave those in the comments below as always. But until then, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, game on.